Hey, everybody, it's Joel Rubin, and welcome back to Making Sense of the World, a podcast on the Siren Network. I'm so excited about our discussion today because we have the extraordinary, the bold, the courageous, the expert, my friend Miles Taylor, to talk with us about everything going on right now in democracy and national security. And just really excited to have this episode to share with you. So, Miles, welcome to Making Sense of the World.
Great to be here with you, my friend. Big Joel Rubin fan, and grateful for everything you've done. So, it seems like we've got a lot to talk about.
We got a lot to talk about. So let's start from the beginning. When you were a kid, did you ever think that you would be in the gun sights of the President of the United States? Sorry. No, we'll skip that. We'll come back to that.
When I was a kid, I was convinced I would grow up to be a Ghostbuster, and I still aspire to be a Ghostbuster. So, you know, if being a dictator buster is all I get, fine, I'll take it.
So, you know, this is fun because you grew up in Indiana, right? So you're from flyover country. Sorry, I apologize because
we liked looking at the plains.
You know, I'm the glowing megalopolis of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is where I grew up, right? And I love Pittsburgh. So Indiana, you grew up in Indiana. You grow up in an environment that is in the heartland, moderate politics, conservative politics. You decide that you want to have a career that engages in, I don't know what exactly, but then September 11th happened. And I'm bringing this up because it had an impact on me. And I wanted to bring this out to start because you and I interacted when you were on Capitol Hill and in different spaces, and you worked on homeland security issues and foreign policy issues with the Republican conference, and came at it from a very patriotic worldview. And I want to let the audience have a feel for who you are and what motivated you to want to get into national security, homeland security work. Like, where did that come from, and what was the trigger moment for you?
Yeah, it really was 9/11, and that may sound trite because that inspired a lot of people to go into public service. It's not necessarily unique, although we really seem to have forgotten what that moment was like in our country. We forgot that feeling of unity and sharedness that is America. But after the attacks happened, I was especially rocked by it. And in part, I think, because I had just been in New York City 2 weeks prior to the attacks and visited the World Trade Center and was up at the observation deck and had lunch there. And so it just felt so palpable to me, having just been in the towers. And I remember watching live the Today Show coverage as they cut to the first tower having been hit, all the way through both towers falling. And so, you know, it was for all Americans a traumatic experience, but it just felt especially visceral to me. And it set me on a path to want to go into national security, and quite simply to prevent a day like that from ever happening again in whatever way I could. That was it. And that may sound simplistic to some ears, especially folks who were too young to remember that day. But it was so focusing in the fact that it seemed like we were facing an existential threat as a country, and a day like that could happen again. And so an entire career and a life could be devoted to stopping that. And so that's why I went into public service. It's ultimately why I came out here to Washington.
I mean, describe your gut, describe your how you felt in your body in that day when you're watching the towers, and then of course after that the hit at the Pentagon. And I was outside the Pentagon on that day giving a speech. I don't know if we ever talked about that, but I was giving a speech outside the Pentagon at a hotel. I think it was the Marriott at the top floor, and we heard the plane fly over our head and crash into.
No kidding.
Yeah, and I, you know, I still have the sickening feeling in the pit of my stomach. But I want, you know, so much of this is like visceral and physical. It's not just intellectual, right? And you know, can you sort of share with the audience your gut reaction to what you saw and what happened that day?
Well, I can remember I was watching with a group of friends that day. We were doing a project together, and this gal named Hannah in my group was watching with us, and I will never forget as the first tower fell. And I'm sure she didn't fully grasp what was going on. We were focused on this project, and I was just glued to the television, what was happening. But you've got some folks who just don't have context for those things. And I remember her laughing as the first tower fell, kind of like a, whoa, what is that? And I immediately shut down any levity in the conversation. And I said, you may have just witnessed the start of World War III. I remember saying those words, and that brought it home for the group of folks that I was with. But as far as the gut punch, Joel, that was more than just a day. I'll be honest with folks. In the aftermath of the attacks, I was diagnosed by a doctor with post-traumatic stress disorder, which sounds
Oh,
quite silly because I wasn't there on the day that it happened. I wasn't in New York. I wasn't in Washington. I wasn't in Pennsylvania where Flight 93 crashed. I was just in small town Indiana watching on television, but it had such a deep impact on me that I became I became obsessive about it, not almost obsessive. I would wake up at 4:30 in the morning, and this is for months and months and months afterwards, and consume every available piece of news
wow.
about what was happening, and stay up late and do the same thing. I just felt like I had to get the hell out of Indiana because that's not where I was going to be helping to stop this. And ultimately, like I said, that's what drove me to Washington D.C. in the aftermath, and first as a page messenger on Capitol Hill. I was a young congressional page messenger in the wake of 9/11. But I got assigned of all, these pages have existed for about 200 years in Washington, D.C., more than 200 years, young messengers that get pulled around the country to come spend the year working on Capitol Hill. And every year, one page gets assigned to the office of the Speaker of the House, who at the time was Dennis Hastert. And I get assigned to Hastert's office. And I'm basically there at the Congressional Nerve Center as, the vice president comes to meet with him to talk about the war on terror, as interim Iraqi Prime Minister Yad Alawi comes and visits. I mean, you name it. That was right there in the middle of the action. And it made me feel like I was in the place I should be, not necessarily Capitol Hill, but, in D.C., helping to advance our efforts to fight back against terrorists. And of course, the deep irony here that I see almost 25 years later is that we were very focused then on the threat from the outside. And now we are being told that the terrorism threat is a threat from within. And that is affecting the life of our nation in a very different but no less dramatic way than 9/11 did.
Well, great minds think alike, I have to humbly say, right? Because you're exactly leading me to where I wanted to go. And for the audience who tunes in, our audience is people from across the country who are interested in what's happening in foreign policy and national security and want to understand it from a perspective of what does it mean, and what's happening inside Washington. How does that impact and sort of influence not just the world events, but influence their lives and impact their lives. And so you're sitting there, as you're describing, right there in the fulcrum of the Capitol. And, for folks, watching today, like in the Capitol, inside the Capitol, there are offices, and you have to kind of wiggle your way up to the Speaker's office from one of the side entrances to the Capitol. And it's like really packed in their offices in the Speaker's suite. And yet it's at the nerve center of decision making. And so in that moment, in these moments, you do feel a sense of, and I can hear it in your voice, a sense of patriotic humility and deep responsibility, right? Because what is happening there is serious, and the people coming in and the decisions being made and information being shared affects millions of lives around the world. And so, I want to jump like in a way to now, like when you hear the way people are talking nowadays about, from the Trump administration in particular, about threats, about the enemy within, using language on terrorism, striking ships. And we had Juan Gonzalez on last week talking to us about Latin America policy and sort of these just the sort of striking boats at Venezuela that have now been designated as foreign terrorist organizations when they were always within the domain of interdiction and law enforcement. I mean, how far have we fallen in this 20 plus years of your experience in terms of taking threats seriously and being honest with the American people about what those threats are?
Well, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that the national security architecture that was built post 9/11 to locate and bring to justice people who were part of violent terrorist organizations is now being turned against the American people. And I was on the opposite side of this debate in the years after 9/11 when civil libertarians said things like the Department of Homeland Security and the Patriot Act were a threat to civil liberties and were a threat to Americans' rights. And maybe not in the immediate term, although a lot of folks at the time made the argument that the Patriot Act was unconstitutional, which I disagreed with. But at a minimum, a lot of those folks said, we are creating the tools that an autocrat could abuse to monitor and harass and punish Americans. And I thought that was, at best, misguided, and at worst, very, very outlandish and
right?
an alarmist and counterproductive, because these tools ended up being remarkably successful in saving American lives. Hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of Americans today are alive who probably otherwise would not have been, because we became so effective at identifying and watch listing terrorists and taking them out and bringing them to justice. A remarkably efficient counterterrorism apparatus was built up. But I was wrong, and those civil libertarians were right, because what ended up happening was a thing that I could have never imagined. And in a sense, that echoes the 9/11 Commission report, which said 9/11 happened because a failure of imagination. Well, the abuse of those tools is happening because a failure of imagination. People like me, people like you probably as well, Joel, never imagined we would have such an obvious wannabe autocrat take over the presidency in the United States, which then made all of the tools of the federal government vulnerable to potential abuse. And the ones that had the fewest institutional safeguards, because they were so young, because they were so new, were those tools in the Department of Homeland Security and the broader counterterrorism apparatus. And now we are seeing an administration very, very nakedly justify the use of those tools for, quite frankly, unjustifiable purposes, to go designate left-leaning organizations as terrorists. And they have opened the door in recent weeks to being able to watch list American citizens for First Amendment protected speech. That sounds very alarmist, but it's also very true. And it's the text of this order, NSPM 7, the National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, that creates this new process for designating domestic terrorist groups. And if folks want to know where that's headed, and I'm sure you guys have talked about this a lot lately, Joel, they need only to look in the Caribbean and other places where the administration is now designating drug cartels as terrorists and using military force to go after them.
So before we get to where this could end up, I want to ask if you can share for the audience a little bit of what it's like to sit at DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and you were a senior advisor and chief of staff there for a good chunk of time in the first Trump term. what is it like? And then from there, you would sit at the Homeland Security Council, National Security Council meetings, and the interagency process at the White House. What is it like to be discussing the internal guardrails on policies like NSPM 7 that you're describing? What kinds of arguments are being made about whether or not to go forward? And I want to just add one layer to this. Based upon what you have seen so far from January 20th until early October of this year, and the sort of mass firing of many of the senior career officials, patriotic officials who've served across the domestic homeland security infrastructure, by their firings and basically taking those layers out. What kinds of discussions do you think they're having inside the departments about how far they can or can't go? And what are their decisions? What are their calculations being made? Do they talk about the Constitution? Do they talk about Congress? Do they just talk about Stephen Miller and Donald Trump? What's going into their decisions about how far they can take this?
Unfortunately, I think very little. And we had a very good example of that in the past few days that was overlooked by a lot of people. A lot of news stories get overlooked right now because there is such a flood of activity from this administration. But there was a story that got put out. A journalist was on a flight and sitting behind one of Stephen Miller's top deputies, who I understand was flying to a family member's funeral, unfortunately. But the person who was on the flight had line of sight of that White House aide's text messages and signal messages. And
great.
Yeah, exactly. Another signal gate. And relayed that Stephen Miller's deputy was messaging with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth's deputy, and they were going back and forth via signal text message about whether to deploy the 82nd Airborne Division into one of these cities, Chicago or Portland. Okay, so let me baseline for a second. The 82nd Airborne Division is the Army's elite unit that helped lead the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Okay, these are the guys that literally parachute into war zones and go clear and hold territory. And it's being talked about like a sandwich order at a restaurant via text message. Okay, so even if this wasn't as egregious as a conversation about sending the 82nd Airborne into an American city, let's just say it was a foreign capital, this wouldn't be something, first, that would be discussed at all on text message. It would not be something that two mid-level aides would be deciding for their bosses via messages. It would be the subject of a highly classified, closely held National Security Council meeting at the highest levels of those cabinet members. But instead, this administration is treating these decisions about whether to send the military into U.S. citizens with the irreverence of a text message conversation. And that, I think, tells us everything we need to know about how far these folks are willing to go. They're willing to go all the way. And by all the way, I mean the closest thing we have in the U.S. constitutional order to martial law, which is the invocation of the Insurrection Act and the deployment of the United States military to go enforce domestic law. I firmly believe that the president will invoke those powers, and that will precipitate a constitutional crisis in this country. But I've also been saying that for 7 years, because in the first Trump administration, he ordered us to invoke the Insurrection Act in multiple circumstances where we had to go back to the president and say, Mr. President, the way you want to do this is not legal. It's not constitutional. and we would walk him back from it. But I knew once those folks who said no were gone, he would bring in compliant lackeys who said, yes, Mr. President, I'll do whatever you say. And I think we're very close to that happening.
So this is a really critical point here. When we talk about democracy, we talk about the Constitution, we talk about how the government operates and the guardrails. We have two very clear, different, and distinct terms of President Trump. We have Trump 1.0 and Trump 2.0. And you served in 1.0, and now we're living through 2.0. In 1.0, it felt like there was a lot of chaos. It felt like there were internal buffers against the worst decisions. In 2.0, it feels like the opposite. Do I have that right? Am I wrong? What do you see as operating differences between the two terms?
It's night and day between the respect for the rule of law and an affirmative effort to torch the Bill of Rights. I mean that in the most literal sense. I think that in that first term, even if Donald Trump had those unlawful impulses, he was surrounded by folks who did not. And I want to clarify. I mean, there's been a mass mischaracterization of the so-called axis of adults thesis, a term that I helped reluctantly propagate in the first Trump administration. And people, especially on the right, came to read that terminology as some sort of deep state internal coup against the president, that there was an unelected group of bureaucrats working to upend the president's lawful orders. That's the operative word, lawful orders. There was no one that I knew in the Trump administration, myself included, who was working to thwart the president's lawful orders. That wasn't our job. If we went into government and didn't like the things that the Republican Party wanted to implement, well, then piss off. Your job is not to be in government. Get out, go work on the other side, go work somewhere else. Those of us who pushed back against Donald Trump, those of us who worked to thwart anything, were very actively working to thwart illegal activity, which has nothing to do with just Trump. Any public servant makes an oath to uphold the Constitution and should be willing to speak truth to power to oppose unlawful orders. The difference between the Trump administration and every other is on an almost daily basis. Donald Trump wanted to break the law in some way, shape, or form. And so that resistance looked like a very frequent, very active effort inside the administration. And Trump was getting it from all sides, not just from DHS. And we were on the receiving end of his ire and his, wild policy ideas more frequently than any other department. But it went everywhere. I mean, you had the Defense Department and the State Department and the CIA and DHS constantly with this friction with the White House because they wanted to do unlawful things. Today, there isn't that friction because they had learned the lesson. I mean, Donald Trump, if he has a radar for anything, he's got a radar for people with a conscience. And he doesn't like it. He does not like to be judged by people with a conscience. And so he systematically, in the first term, identified and either fired or pushed out most of those people. And in a second term, made sure that he didn't bring them in. And that's why I think you've seen the administration do things that are definitionally so unconscionable, is because they have a team that largely lacks a conscience.
So when we look at this in this dynamic and we see the churn happening now, for example, with the National Guard being attempting to deploy the National Guard to cities or to Portland, or to move the Guard from California, if not there, from Texas and different places, sort of a whack-a-mole, just desperate to send the National Guard as opposed to surge resources to local law enforcement and partner with them to deal with very discrete crimes. When you see that, do you see an administration that's acting with confidence or an administration that's acting out of fear?
That's a good question. I think a little bit of both. But I think the fear is not what you would expect. The fear is that the clock is running. Time is linear, and you can't rerun history. And people like Stephen Miller at the White House, the president's Homeland Security Advisor and Deputy Chief of Staff, are very well aware that they only have so much time to create the precedent that they want to create. And it's something that Stephen talked to me about not infrequently during the first term. I can remember sitting in his office on the second floor of the West Wing and him pointing to a drawer and saying, I've got a stack of executive orders in here that will come out in a second administration if we win in 2020. And in his words, it would be a, quote, shock and awe blitz if they retook the White House. Because, as he described to me, we need to do all of these things as fast as possible in the first year because we'll get sued. And then we want to run that up to the Supreme Court and get as much affirmative clearance as possible to go do these extreme things. And think about that for a moment. They had a strategy to come back into office and break the law as fast as possible to just see where they would get the court's permission and where they would not to be able to expand presidential power. And that's what they've done. I mean, we've had dozens of judicial decisions against the administration on constitutional grounds, and they're appealing a lot of those up to the Supreme Court in the hope that they might get the court to side with them on at least some of them. And they have done that shock and awe blitz. So the fear is the fear about the clock. They're worried that they're not getting enough done. That's why you're seeing them act so fast. The confidence, I think you see in the brazenness of it all. And they're also so convinced of their own rectitude that they're unwilling to hear any dissent, including within the Republican Party. And I still talk to a number of my former colleagues, including on Capitol Hill, who are ostensibly still in the MAGA movement. And there's a great deal of fear about what's happening and how fast it's moving. But that fear is far outweighed by another fear, which is that they will be kicked out of the tribe if they say anything. And the silence has really been deafening this time around from my former party.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. As you're talking, I can't help but think that you're speaking as an American patriot, as someone who is loyal to the Constitution, who believes in protecting our country and the values for which we stand, the goals of democracy overall, the belief in the rule of law. And I gotta tell you, Miles, the thing that really, and for lack of a better way to describe it, really bums me out, really upsets me, is that in Washington, basically, it's all up to the ethics of the people who get the jobs and who are in the sort of power positions or whatnot in those jobs, because there are lots of rules and there's lots of language and there are lots of laws. But if your ethics tell you don't want to obey them or observe them and you want to do something else, you can find a way out. You can find a way around it. You can game the system. And it just looks like they literally have absolutely no interest in following any of the expectations that the American people have for what the rule of law is all about and the Constitution is all about. And I guess my question to you, and you know these people, you've worked in this, you're a thought leader in this space. Why? Like, why, right? Is it Russia? Is it immigration? Is it narcissism? I don't know. Why do you think this administration and this group is so interested in pushing the boundaries of the American democratic system beyond where it's ever gone before?
Because the leader of that party wants them to. And that sounds simplistic. You would think, but why? I mean, why would they so blindly follow a leader? Well, we have the benefit of thousands of years of civilization to study this phenomenon. It is not unique to the United States by any measure. It's not even unique to the past century. We've seen dozens of examples of the masses quite blindly following a leader off the cliff. a leader who wants to undermine whatever the norms of the time and the country are. And we always ask ourselves, why? How do people just fall in with this? And why would they blindly follow a leader? And at the core of it is another type of fear. And in the past, I've given this sort of semi-comical example as Jerry Seinfeld used to open his sets with this joke, and rooted in reality, as all good comedy is. And he said, a survey came out recently of Americans' top 10 fears, and their number one fear was public speaking, and number two on the list was death. And Jerry Seinfeld used to joke, so your average American is more scared of giving the eulogy than laying in the casket, which I found to be actually a pretty incisive observation on human nature, is folks would rather be caught dead than caught speaking out, than caught declaring a position, than being seen in front of their peers and risking the potential for embarrassment. And that gets to our very, very tribal nature, which is rooted in evolutionary biology. We're so tribal by design as a means of protection in the wild that we are willing to defy the underlying values of the tribe if the tribal leader tells us to, because the bigger fear than speaking up to the leader is that you might get booted from the tribe and lose everything and lose that protection. And that's tantamount to death. And those same impulses affect us today. And you see this in our politics, where people of great principle, or at least who portray themselves as people of great principle and values, have so quickly thrown those values and principles out the window if Donald Trump wants them to. And there is no better example of that to me than former U.S. Senator and now Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And I regret to say that, but I worked a good deal with Rubio and his team when he was on Capitol Hill to pass a lot of good legislation. I've supported organizations, pro-democracy groups that he's on the board of, and seen him over the years really laying out what I thought was one of the most compelling cases for human freedom and America's commitment to advance the values of human freedom of almost any elected leader in Washington. And now even his close friends and former aides have said that Marco is unrecognizable in this new job. He has traded proximity to the president. He's traded his principles for proximity to the president and to power, and is a really good case study of why people will continue to follow the tribal leader even to the ends of the earth.
The good news about our democracy is that we have alternatives, right? We have political alternatives. We do have Democrats. We do have the Forward Party, of which you played a very, very significant role. We have independents. We have alternative choices. From where you sit and what you've just described and the sort of direction of the White House, I mean, what do those of us who are not in that community, place, tribe, however people want to describe it, cult, some call it, whatever you want to call it, those of us who are not in it, what do we need to do to think in terms of not just dealing within the daily basis, but also over time to make sure that we're not going to just become the inverse of that, right? And I got to tell you, in the Democratic Party, one of the things that I am deeply worried about is that we're learning some bad lessons here. We're learning lessons that we shouldn't be learning about governance and about language and about how to deal with difference. I don't want us to basically just do the same thing in reverse if we ever get back into power. So what's your advice for folks who are no longer in the Republican Party or who are on the outside right now and trying to figure out how to navigate this period right now?
Well, I do think you cite a big worry here, which is that we could end up in what I would call ping pong politics, where the same measures that many of us are decrying that the Trump administration has undertaken will later be said to be the measures that need to be undertaken to unwind what has happened.
Hmm.
So let me be more specific about that. Donald Trump has unilaterally gone in and deleted federal agencies with things like DOJ and fired federal workers en masse and replaced them with new cadres of federal workers that are ideologically aligned with him. That's the second phase of his purge that he's going into, is he's restocking the federal government with people that are ideologically aligned with him. Well, you might see a left-leaning person come into office and say, well, the only way we can clean up what Donald Trump has done is go use some of those illegal authorities to delete agencies, to recreate agencies, and to fire the federal workers that came in that we think are too ideological. And you would have a lot of support for that, of folks saying, yeah, we can do it this one time. We can use those borderline illegal, in some cases illegal, interpretations of presidential power to just undo what Donald Trump did. And then we won't do it again. But that will perpetuate the cycle. And then all of a sudden, across presidential administrations and parties, we will have normalized anti-constitutional behavior. And I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, and it's going to require a lot of restraint. And I think the only way it will happen is whoever leads the Democratic Party next, whoever's seen as the most viable candidate for president, has to have that restraint as a part of their core messaging. And it could go both ways. You see examples in history of leaders making the case to the population that the only way to save a country is to fight fire with fire. Mm-hmm. And that's a very compelling, very easy to communicate proposition when you feel like your country is in mortal danger. But it also becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you fight fire with fire, the whole thing burns down. And it takes a much different kind of leader to explain why there must be restraint. So look, I don't know, for folks who are disaffected Republicans like me, that there's a natural political home for them. But right now, regardless of where people sit on the political spectrum, if they have an interest in seeing the continuation of America's constitutional order, then they must be caucusing together. I'm not technically a member of any party right now. I was interested in seeing something like a third party created with Forward Party. I still think there are things like that in our future that will make democracy competitive and healthy again somewhere down the road. But right now, what matters isn't so much your party registration. It matters what you end up doing when you go into the voting booth. And do you put aside your previous political labels and vote for the people who are going to protect our democracy? I will say this, I disagree with Democrats on as many issues as I did before Donald Trump became president. I worked hard against the Obama administration's agenda, as you know, and I was proud to be in the loyal opposition and to be fighting in policy debates, honest policy debates in this country. There's no disagreement in my mind, though, with Democrats around the foundational threat to our democracy and to the continuation of that constitutional order. And I can't see why any other issue would be more important to that than me. And so I've largely pushed any of those things to the side because this is a moment we need to come together as Americans to actually make sure that the country continues in any recognizable form. So, for the moment, it's voting and it's speaking out. I think that's the most important thing for folks to do. I mean, there's a French philosopher I wrote about on my Substack this week who, in the 1500s made a very simple but very salient point, which is that in tyranny, in autocracies, it's not the dictator that retains and expands power. It's not the dictator that's all powerful. The dictator has eyes and ears and flesh and bones and two hands, and that's it. The reason dictators are powerful is the consent of the governed, is that people largely will submit. And until they decide to stop submitting, they are not free. They are in servitude. This is a lesson that we are relearning, as often happens throughout history, that if we are compliant, if we acquiesce, we will get what this would-be autocrat is seeking, which is to remake the system of the American Republic into a quasi-autocratic one. So we have to make that decision to stand or to kneel. And I think right now, regardless of party, folks have that choice. And if they choose to stand, history would tell us that we have a far greater likelihood of resisting this and restoring the rule of law in this country.
Well, this is it's a powerful way to close the discussion. Miles, you are speaking to our audience from a position of credibility and also reminding people of the foundational principles of our country. The reason this is such a great country is because of our constitutional system, our rules of law, our openness, our democracy, our ability to continually renew ourselves. It's our foundational core. It's our ethos as an American people and the rule of law. That's what's made this such a successful, dynamic country to live in. One where which I'm so grateful to be part of, and reminding people that we all are responsible for the future of this country, that we all have ownership of it. We are all active citizens in it, that we all have a voice in it is very powerful and very empowering. And I got to commend you, man, for your chutzpah, your guts, your cojones to share not just your ideas, but to then go out there and really push them and promote them. And it's that example of courage that also creates ripples of success and brings other people into, including myself, into the comfort zone of being willing to speak out and speak on behalf of and for our country that we love. And it goes back to your experience in getting into public service because of us getting hit by people who want to destroy our country. And that ethics, that view that continues to this day. And I really appreciate your sharing it and helping us to make sense of the world as we see it right now. Because the only way we're going to make sure we deal with it is to be honest with what we see happening right now. And so thank you for being a voice of clarity at this very, very complicated moment. Miles Taylor, thank you for helping us to make sense of the world.
Thank you, my friend.